Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking the intelligence behind unidentified anomalous phenomena UAPs, and we're throwing the traditional map right out the window. We are tackling a truly controversial hypothesis, the extratempestrial theory, or ETT.
It really is the ultimate evolutionary question. If the occupants of these craft are not extraterrestrial, aliens from another star system, could they be extratempestrial? Meaning, they're us, our radically evolved descendants traveling back through time.
And they're coming back to deal with the problem that we created. The stack of source material you shared with us is incredible. It connects everything from, well, high-level theoretical physics and UFO disclosure history to these deep ocean anomalies and modern anthropology.
Right, and our mission today is to synthesize all of that. We're looking for the key biological, technological, and historical arguments that suggest the visitors are future humans. It's a shortcut, really, to understanding the entire scope of the ETT argument.
Okay, let's start with the context then. Disclosure. The sources suggest this isn't some sudden world-stopping event. It's a slow burn, a decades-long process described as normalizing the whole concept.
It's a very managed, slow leak. And if you look back to, say, the 1970s media, you can see these complex ideas being subtly introduced. That era of filmmaking, like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, it wasn't just entertainment.
No, it was feeding concepts. I remember reading that, like the radiation burns you see on the characters and the whole time displacement thing with the World War II soldiers getting out of the craft.
Exactly. We've been culturally pre-programmed in a way, and that leads right into the official decision that apparently sealed the lid on the secret decades ago. The source material details how prominent thinkers were brought in to do an intense risk assessment.
A risk assessment on what? On telling the public.
On telling the public about recovered, crashed UAPs and, well, biological remains. They tried to quantify the risk. What would the fallout be on global finance, on religion, on governmental stability?
I can't even imagine that meeting. So what was the conclusion?
The consensus was that the negatives, the risks of profound societal shock, of chaos, just massively outweigh any perceived benefit. So that assessment led to the continuation of secrecy.
And part of that risk they weighed, I assume, was the potential for profound human unity, which sounds like a positive. We've all heard that idea, from Reagan's UN speech, that we'd finally unite if we faced an external alien threat.
It sounds wonderful on the surface, but the sources really push back on that. They explored the dark side of a forced collective consciousness. If a future state of humanity involves losing our individuality for the sake of unity, what do we actually lose?
You lose the grit, the friction. The sources argue that so many of the fun parts about being an imperfect person, creativity, art, music, are fueled by personal trauma and angst. If everyone thinks the same way, you kill the catalyst for innovation.
And that loss of diversity, biological, psychological, that turns out to be the whole reason they might be coming back in the first place, which shifts our focus to the evolutionary pressures driving this whole theory.
Right, and this is where the anthropology just hits so hard. The sources introduce this idea that modern Homo sapiens, us in 2025, we're physically feeble compared to our ancestors.
Absolutely. Just think about Neanderthals. They were physically superior in almost every way, stronger, immensely more durable. They even had a visual cortex that was up to 20% larger than ours. We are, in effect, self-domesticating. We're getting weaker.
And those pressures are accelerating because of what's happening right now. The reproductive crisis in industrialized societies. I saw the stats in the source material. A documented 60% reduction in global sperm counts. That's staggering.
It is, and that is the central connection for the ETT. The theory holds that these future descendants are facing catastrophic genetic and reproductive failures. Failures due to trends we started, self-domestication, hormonal changes from our environment, and maybe even genetic engineering screw-ups with future tech like CRISPR.
And suddenly, the physical appearance of the archetypal gray alien just clicks into place. The large heads, the huge eyes, those spindly bodies with no muscle mass. Paedomorphic, childlike features.
It's precisely what an anthropologist would predict if the brain continues its exponential growth while the body just continues to degrade. But the most compelling evidence cited for this genetic crisis is what's called the gamete imperative.
The gamete imperative.
The persistent, repeated reports from abductees of UAP occupants extracting reproductive material, gametes, eggs, sperm. It's just too common to ignore.
And the sources drive this home with that incredible story from Rendlesham Forest, the binary code that James Penniston received. When they deciphered it, the message allegedly said, "We're you from the future. We're having problems with reproduction."
Exactly. They need wild-type, unmanipulated gametes. They aren't trying to start a new race. It's an emergency genetic repair mission on their own failing lineage, using our past, uncorrupted DNA.
That's a powerful motive. But, okay, the biggest hurdle for me and for most people with ETT is time travel itself.
Yeah.
How do they solve the grandfather paradox? Going back in time without changing the timeline and, erasing themselves?
They solve it by operating within the physics model that most modern physicists actually favor, the block universe. So imagine time isn't a flowing river. It's a solidified block of 4 dimensions. Past, present, and future all exist simultaneously.
So if a future human travels back to 2025, they're not changing history. They were always a part of our history. Their action was a fixed event. So no paradox.
Precisely. And this model supports the observational data. The saucer shape, for instance, isn't arbitrary. Early solutions to Einstein's field equations showed that a rapidly rotating, highly energetic disk could create the specific distortions in space-time needed for backward travel. They're called closed time-like curves.
And those distortions would explain the unbelievable performance of things like the Tic Tac UAP, that ability to switch from air to water instantly, or make those 90-degree turns without slowing down.
That's the space-time bubble theory. They create a kind of warp field around the craft. Inside that bubble, the occupants might feel 1 or 2 Gs of force, while the exterior of the craft is performing maneuvers at 50,000 miles per hour. It explains how they move through air and water with zero resistance.
And the power source for that kind of technology has to be zero-point energy, or ZPE, which is, it's revolutionary. Tapping into subquantum energy for theoretically infinite decentralized power. It could end our reliance on the grid tomorrow.
But here's the synthesis the sources provide. If our descendants mastered ZPE, why haven't they just fixed our energy crisis for us? Well, as the biologist E.O. Wilson is quoted as saying, humanity has prehistoric emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. They probably can't risk giving us that kind of power in our current state. We're not ready for it.
That makes a terrifying amount of sense, and it explains the secrecy within our own systems, too. The sources highlight this issue of stovepiping, extreme compartmentalization in the military reverse engineering programs.
Yeah, the propulsion engineers can't talk to the material scientists. The physicists are kept separate from the people with the biometric data. This kind of secrecy prevents a holistic understanding of what could be the most important discovery in human history.
And if they have bases here on Earth, maybe the reason we haven't found them is because they're hiding in the one place we barely look, the deep ocean. This brings us to the whole crypto-terrestrial hypothesis.
Well, we know more about the surface of Mars than we do about 95% of our own ocean floor. It's the perfect hiding spot. And we have repeated reports of USOs, unidentified submerged objects, massive craft, sometimes football field-sized, moving at like 500 knots underwater without a wake.
Which, again, just circles right back to that space-time bubble technology. It insulates them from the water resistance. And the anomalies aren't just contemporary. The sources mention things like the Baltic Sea anomaly, a structure with pillars and right angles on the seafloor.
It's not supposed to be there. And if we look even further back into deep history, we have to talk about the finds in Peru. The controversial tridactyl mummies, 3-fingered, 3-toed beings. Their anatomy, no sternum, elongated crania, that 3-digit structure. It falls outside any known human or primate evolutionary line.
And what's fascinating is the cultural context there. Ancient people in that exact region were already practicing intentional cranial modification. Were they lengthening their own skulls to, emulate gods who already looked like these beings? It suggests a really long history of interaction.
And the final piece, the final evolutionary indicator from the sources, is the most consistent report in all of contact phenomena. Communication, telepathy.
Right. If the extratempestrials communicate primarily through thought, what does that say about our own future? Is our reliance on verbal language actually an evolutionary step backward? Was telepathy a primal skill that atrophied? And we're only now, with things like Neuralink, starting to unlock it again.
It connects everything. The gray is the physical future, telepathy is the mental future. Both suggest a hyper-evolutionary path that we're on.
We have covered a huge amount of ground today.
Yeah.
From the politics of disclosure and our reproductive health crisis, all the way to block universe physics, zero-point energy, and these shocking links in ancient Peru.
And the core tension of the extratempestrial theory is exactly what you highlighted. If they are us from the future, they are simultaneously intensely focused on our biological survival. They're desperate for those gametes. Yet they seem radically detached from our current socio-political conflicts. They won't intervene in war or genocide. They're only concerned with their own survival, which depends on our past.
Well, thank you for laying out these sources and theories. They tie together human weakness and speculative cosmology in a way that is just really compelling.
My pleasure. It's a lot to think about.
It certainly is. Now, for our final thought for you to explore on your own. If the extratempestrial theory is correct, and future humans are already coming back to harvest our genetics to ensure their survival, what ethical responsibilities do we owe to the future versions of ourselves? And specifically, what future catastrophe are we obligated to prevent right now?